Good evening. My name is Michael Kraus, and I direct our program in Russian and East European Studies. And I'm delighted to welcome in our midst Jacques Rupnik. I should say welcome back because Jacques was actually here about 3 years ago last, but he also, well, some 5-6 years ago taught a winter term here at Middlebury, and so it is. He's come back to us to share a perspective on the subject that he knows well and that he's working going to speak about tonight. He's presently visiting senior fellow at the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Russian Studies at Harvard University. And he's there working on an update or a sequel rather, to a book that he published in 1989 called The Other Europe. And it really is a look at what's happened in East and Central Europe since 1989. And he's eminently qualified to do just that. Jacques has been educated all over the place. As a matter of fact, he holds degrees in history from the University of Paris, Sorbonne, political science from the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, a master's degree in Soviet studies from Harvard University, and a PhD in history of international relations from the University of Paris. He, before becoming what he is today, Director of Research at CERI at Sciences Po Paris, and a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges, Belgium. He has served, among other things, as East expert on East Europe for the BBC World Service, as executive director of the International Commission for the Balkans of Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as a member of the Independent International Commission on Kosovo, as well as a visiting professor at the Department of Government at Harvard University. He has published more than a score of books on a variety of subjects, mostly having to do with the other Europe. But he's all, and they have appeared in many different languages. In fact, he writes his books and articles or he can and has written them in at least 3 or 4 different languages, not requiring a translator. He's also served as an advisor to French President François Mitterrand, and as well as the Czech President Václav Havel. That alone makes him it puts him into a rather unique category. His subject today is The Empire Strikes Back, American and European Responses to a Resurgent Russia. I'm delighted to welcome him back here.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your kind introduction. It's great to be back. As Michael mentioned, I have been here as a visitor several times already. It's always a great pleasure to visit this campus, and this always interesting group of students. I'm mainly looking forward to our discussion. When I was asked which title to give, I initially suggested something called George on My Mind. And I was told, no, you know, nobody here would remember Ray Charles. The students nowadays, they don't. No. So I thought, you know, perhaps Back in USSR would be an appropriate title. No, you know, students, Middlebury, they don't listen to the Beatles anymore. So, you know, Empire Strikes Back was suggested to me, and that's more familiar and more in tune with the abundant recent literature about empires, imperialism, some of it to do with the US unipolar moment and post-Iraq adventures in Mesopotamia, some of it to do with the European Union role on its eastern neighborhood. I had written a few years ago an article about the EU as a substitute for an empire, substitute for a Habsburg Empire, for instance, for the Central Europeans. Well, now we are talking after Georgia, after this summer, Russia moves to the forefront of the neo-imperial metaphors. A small war, but with big consequences, potentially. The tanks of August clearly have changed the international perception of Russia. And those who didn't pay much attention to it until now have certainly had to adapt quickly. But it is far from clear what would be the policy consequences and what are the different readings, interpretations of this in Europe and in the United States. And this is really what I would like to talk about. First, briefly to say why Georgia matters, and then move on to say what does a crisis tell us about Russia, and what does it tell us about Western responses, that is the European Union in particular. That's what I'm more qualified to say, and I'll say something briefly about the United States, but I'm sure there are people in this room who know more about this than I do, and that will be good for our discussion. So first, why Georgia matters. On August 7, Georgian military launched a military attack on Tskhinvali, the capital of South Ossetia. On August 8, Russian troops moved into Georgia, well beyond the two enclaves of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. I don't want to go into the well-rehearsed arguments about who provoked whom or who started what. If indeed it was a Russian trap, well, then Mr. Saakashvili, the Georgian leader, jumped in it with great enthusiasm and little foresight. It seems more relevant to mention some of the main issues at stake. The first is that the so-called frozen conflict, the label given to a series of unresolved ethnic and territorial issues at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, and indeed of Yugoslavia at the same time, have been resurfacing. And those who want to understand the Georgian problem shouldn't start this summer. They may go back in history, particularly history of Soviet Russia under Stalin, but closer to home, they may go back to what happened immediately after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And for that, they may look at the latest issue of the New York Review of Books, an article by Robert English, who I think Michael knows as well. He published an article of his in one of your volumes. And he published an article, a very interesting, Georgia, the Ignored History. And the history he's talking about is, the forgotten history, is that of extreme nationalist policies of the first post-communist president of Georgia, Zviad Gamsakhurdia, whose rhetoric and policies have completely alienated the minorities of Georgia, which make up about a third of the population, building a unitary nation-state in a multi-ethnic environment, proved to be a very conflictual and daring adventure. I quote Robert English, "Trying to understand the Ossetian, Abkhazian, and other minorities' alienation from Georgia without reference to the extreme nationalism of Gamsakhurdia is like trying to explain Yugoslavia's collapse and Kosovo's secession while ignoring the nationalist policies of Slobodan Milosevic. Georgia's, and this end of quotation, Georgia's inability to offer inclusive citizenship after 1991 allowed Russia to posture as a protector of its nationals and other minorities in Georgia. So the citizenship struggles and the sovereignty wars of the early 1990s have now resurfaced under President Saakashvili. Which brings me to the second reason, second issue, and that is the Rose Revolution that President Saakashvili was a leading protagonist of, the so-called Colored Revolution, started in Georgia in November 2003, and as you know, extended then to the Ukraine in the Orange Revolution of December 2004. And there have been few others which I will not dare qualify as democratic revolution. What happened in Kyrgyzia and elsewhere is more debatable. But anyway, that was the wave of the so-called colored revolutions, new attempts at democratizing societies that didn't do too well in the first transition after the breakup of the Soviet Union, which actually was good news. It meant those who didn't make it in the first transition to democracy got a second chance. It's not often then in history that you get a chance to have another go. Except that these were not revolutions against communism, they were revolutions against post-communism. And what is post-communism? Václav Havel has a very concise definition. He says this is authoritarian regimes and mafia capitalism. That is his definition of the post-communist regime. So these were popular revolutions against these sort of authoritarian regimes. And as I say, they don't necessarily lead you to democracy. We can discuss that later, but at least there were attempts at democratization. Now that process clearly challenged Russian influence in the region, and that is the second reason why Russia became involved increasingly, especially after the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. The third reason, I'm not giving them in the order of importance, perhaps this one is the most important, is that this region on the southern periphery of Russia, the Caucasus, is strategically important for energy supply, for the energy pipeline politics, if you want. The whole western part of Europe has been trying to avoid the Russian control over the supply of energy, opting for a Turkish option from the Caspian through Georgia down to Turkey, that is the Baku-Tiflis-Ceylan pipeline, which then through the Nabucco project connects all the way to Western Europe. So South Ossetia is on the main east-west axis through Georgia, and maybe we can have the map of Georgia, the second. No, that's the first. Okay. So you have from the Caspian to the Black Sea, and Georgia becomes, from this point of view, a crucially important transit route. All the more so that Armenia is, for historical reasons, an ally of Russia. Historical, that was against Turkey. More recently, it was against Azerbaijan. There is the whole conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh, which I don't want to go into right now, but simply to explain why Armenia is an ally of Moscow. And Azerbaijan has, because of the present troubles in Georgia, decided to reduce its reliance on North Caucasus pipeline and decides to supply via Iran, a great stable country, as we all know. Energy politics is really the major concern in Russia's move into Georgia. I understand you had a lecture recently here about energy politics. I will not therefore go too much into it. But this is clearly the main issue because that is the key to the relations between Russia and Europe. So from the Russian point of view, this is a key element. The second issue from the Russian point of view, keep the so-called democratizing revolutions or the colored revolutions in check. I mentioned Saakashvili, but clearly the most important was Ukraine, December 2004. One observer, Ivan Krastev, has compared the importance of December 2004 for Russia to 9/11 for the United States. He says this is a turning point. This is absolute turning point. This is when the Russians decided never again. This must not happen again. And they deployed all sorts of means to make sure that this would not happen. And Georgia is a close ally of Ukraine. And if you think Georgia's problems are complicated with South Ossetia and Abkhazia, I don't know whether yeah. Okay, that's a bit too dark. But anyway, maybe in the discussion I can identify better these two. If you think Georgia is complicated with these two enclaves, Ukraine is really the crucial issue because first you have the question of the Crimea. That used to belong to Russia. Khrushchev, in his great wisdom, gave it in 1954 to the Ukraine. Didn't matter because it was all part of the Soviet Union. And anyway, nobody had a right to speak on those matters. So it was done. But from the point of view of the Russians, this is a meaningless act. And there's no reason. If Ukraine becomes independent, okay, we get back the Crimea. That is the Russian thinking. And you have seen the mayor of Moscow, Mr. Lushkov, recently visiting South Ossetia. Well, he's also very outspoken on the issue of the Crimean. Therefore, you can see the importance Russia using these territorial issues, Lushkov being simply a spokesman, let's say, for the most radical wing of Russian nationalist thinking today, but certainly not an isolated one. So that is one issue. The second issue is the question of the naval base. In Sebastopol, on the Black Sea, Russia has retained, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, that naval base. The agreement expires in 2017, and obviously the Russians are already putting pressure about the renewal and the new military facilities they want to install there, and this is clearly a major sore point with the government in Kiev. And the third question, very important in this context, is to see how relationship to Russia divides internally Ukrainian politics. We saw that during the so-called Orange Revolution, Yushchenko versus Yanukovych, the West against the East of the country. That was sort of the simplification, if you want, a country that is a new state. It didn't exist until December 91, until the breakup of the Soviet Union, that a country is divided inside about its relationship to Russia. Interestingly, now it's not just divided between the two protagonists of that famous election, it is divided within the Orange Coalition between President Yushchenko and his main rival, Mrs. Tymoshenko. You probably have seen her very interesting hairstyle and very outspoken politics, but she, at least on this issue, is the cautious, prudent one who wants to deal business with Russia. She also understands how dependent Ukraine is on Russian energy supply. But clearly for Russia, for the future of Russia, it's not just Georgia that matters and what happened this summer. What matters is Ukraine, the attitude to Ukraine. Zbigniew Brzezinski has a formula where he says Russia cannot be an empire and a democracy. With Ukraine, it remains an empire. So his argument, of course, this is slightly Polish argument, but his argument is if Russia wants to be a democracy, it should really part with any post-imperial velleities, and therefore that is a good case not only for supporting Ukrainian democracy, but saying, well, this is the best way to support Russian democracy. As I say, this is not a widely shared argument in Russia, and there is really a debate going on among experts, among foreign policy analysts, about how to read what has happened and how to read, indeed, the recent period. I would almost say how to read the last 20 years. You could either see it since Gorbachev, through the Yeltsin period, perhaps even the beginning of the Putin era. It was at least an element of ambiguity. You could say this was a period perhaps not of democratic transitions, as people were perhaps simplistically labeling it at the time, but certainly of pluralization of Russian politics, of democratic opening, of space for civil society. And that was a period, I think, of unprecedented length in Russian history. You may have earlier periods of democratization at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, 1905, 1907. You had reformist Athens under Stolypin or under Witte. My former Harvard teacher at Keenan had used to say that the period starting 1897, that was a kind of modernization. He was not saying democratization, and the democratizing element came really after. So whichever way you look at it, this has been the longest period in Russian history of not democracy Western style, but pluralization of Russian politics, democratizing, opening to the outside world. And therefore one argument says, well, now the second term of Putin clearly has put an end to it, and if you really want to put a date on the final end of this period, well, you may as well pick August of this summer. This is not only internally Russia becoming more authoritarian, more autocratic. My colleague Pierre Asner has written an article, Russia's transition to autocracy, sort of after Russia's transition to democracy. Now we had the other way around. And you could also say, well, we had a lot of discussions about the end of the Cold War and Gorbachev's contribution to it. Well, perhaps now people were wondering, do we have a new Cold War starting with Putin's contribution to it? So that is one reading, let's say a more pessimistic reading, that would say this period is now closed, and we better brace ourselves for a long period of something really, really different. You may have, as some authors have suggested, well, those who are pessimistic about Russian history are saying, we never believed Russia could become democracy. Somebody like Richard Pipes, who has a long view of Russian history, and says, this is a long view where the state dominates the society, huge centralized bureaucracy has been the main instrument of economic and social change. It is the state that reshapes the society, not the other way around. And in this perspective, even communism was like the ultimate stage of Russian statism, of Russian bureaucratic statism. So you can see it that way, and therefore you would see the current period where the state is re-centralizing, reclaiming its power and its authority as, Russian history sort of reclaiming its long-term course. Or this was Martin Malia's view, another great recently deceased expert on Russian history. He wrote a very interesting book called Russia Under Western Eyes, where he has a more, well, he has a more divided view of Russian politics and society. He sees the westernizing, modernizing element there as very important. He sees very much Russian history as part of European history, not as something in contrast or conflict with Europe. And he would say, okay, this is not Western liberal democracy, but it's a chaotic process which is moving in a direction which may lead one day to something that would resemble a democratic pluralist society. And the main argument for that would be, I mean, Martin Malia is no longer here to make that argument, but I suppose one argument he could make is that whatever happened to Russian institutions, there is a new middle class in Russia that has emerged in the last 20 years. And the Carnegie Center in Moscow has actually produced a study on this, quite interesting. And the question is, you know, what about this new middle class? It's mainly now a middle class of consumers. It's a middle class that has been used to travel, to do certain things, has not had a political voice yet, doesn't have a political party. If you look at the liberal parties, they're not very strong. But the argument would be, over the years, if this class of middle class, small entrepreneurs, enlightened intelligentsia, etc., that could, in due course, change the picture of Russian politics too. Maybe you can make this sociological argument, but in the meantime, the politics and the military politics of Putin go the other way. Incidentally, just to give military spending up 50% in 2 years for 2008-2009. So this is not terribly encouraging. And the real question, therefore, back to what Zbigniew Brzezinski said, is can Russian politics digest the loss of an empire? Because one thing is, you know, can it let Ukraine have its democratizing process? But the other is for Russians themselves. Because end of communism is one thing. It happens simultaneously with an end of an empire. And in a way, you can say this is a double failure for Russia. And it's partly an emancipation, the end of communism, but the loss of empire is experience of perceived by many as also a humiliation. And this is why this new attitude, assertive attitudes towards the near abroad, becomes such an important stake in Russian politics. The loss of empire, as we know historically, is always politically problematic for democracies, even for democracies. But still, Britain without India was Britain. France without Algeria was France. But what is Russia without an empire? Nobody quite knows. That is it. I mean, the reasonable answer would be, well, keep the borders of the Russian Federation as they're left after the Soviet Union. That's the reasonable answer. But we can see that if you have 25 million Russians living outside those borders, and especially if you now have some hostile regimes, or perceived as hostile by Russia, on Russia's borders, regimes wanting to join NATO, for instance, or wanting to put American military bases, etc. That becomes then an opportunity for post-imperial politics to reassert themselves, and the opportunity this summer was provided, as I said, by President Saakashvili. So that is why this matters for the Russians. For Europe, and before I say something about America, but for Europe, I think we have two things. We have a double paradox. First, Europe doesn't have an army as such. European states have an army, but if you ask, like Stalin said about the Pope, Vatican, how many divisions? Well, if you ask Europe, how many divisions? Europe as such doesn't have much division. Yet, it has played a major mediating role in this conflict. So that is the first paradox. And the second paradox is Europe was really deeply divided about its perceptions of Russia and about the policies that should be followed. Yet, curiously, it managed to preserve a united front and have a coherent single policy during this crisis. So I don't need to dwell on the role of the European Union during the crisis. I think you are perhaps familiar with it, although I felt the American press didn't do much justice to it. You know, when Henry Kissinger in the old days said, Europe, what telephone number? That was his way of saying, there is no such thing as Europe. You know, there are European states, but there is no. Well, in this case, there was actually a telephone number, and you could give him the telephone number of President Sarkozy. He was not only the president of France, he happened to be at that time to be presiding over the European Union. And he, after consulting some of his European colleagues, very promptly intervened during the crisis. Within days, that is the crisis on August 8, the invasion on August 12, he was already in Moscow and in Tbilisi. He negotiated the six-point agreement, the ceasefire, the end of the fighting. He prevented, it was European intervention that prevented the Russians going all the way to Tbilisi. They were ready to do that. And it was the French president who insisted that Saakashvili remains in office. Initially, the Russian posture was they will not talk to anybody until Saakashvili is removed. And Sarkozy and Kouchner said this is totally unacceptable, such preconditions. They negotiated the return of refugees, and now it is all part of these Geneva talks that have opened concerning Abkhazia and Ossetia. They were already interrupted for some procedural reasons. That is normal, I was going to say, that happens. But you had Europe there responding promptly. Sarkozy didn't have time to even consult with his American counterparts. President Bush was at the Olympics at the time, and Condi Rice was on holiday. So he, partly lucky, partly improvising, managed to achieve something which was, I think, all the more impressive, at least in my view, that it happened in a, in fact, deeply divided European Union. So this position of strength, being the mediator, being the middleman, being the initiative, etc., hyperactivity of the French president, all this happening in a context where Europe is actually divided. And I will briefly mention three of the divides. Well, first they were divided about the perception of the Georgian crisis itself. I'm simplifying deliberately for the sake of the discussion, but on the whole, you can put it in the following way. For most West Europeans, the dominant view was that the reckless action of President Saakashvili offered Russia the opportunity to do militarily what it had wanted to do for quite a while, and that is to dispatch its troops to South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Okay. In Eastern Europe, among the new member states of the European Union, who, need I remind you, were for 40 years under Soviet domination, the tanks of August, crossing into Georgia, for Czechs, it rings a bell. It's a different. You perceive the event in a different light. So all sorts of parallels, not just on the Czechs, but the Poles, the Balts, etc., immediately started to talk about a new Munich. Even the Swedish Prime Minister is the only one who joined the East Europeans together with Polish Prime Minister on this note. You know, Russia in Georgia, like Nazi Germany vis-à-vis Czechoslovakia, using the Sudetenland. I don't know whether any of you are writing papers or master theses on the uses of and abuses of the Munich analogy in historical or history of international relations. If you were to pursue that parallel, that would be something like President Beneš giving the order to the Czech army to bomb the Sudetenland, which then would provoke, you know, the invasion of Hitler's troops. So I think the Munich parallel I don't find terribly convincing. Nevertheless, a sort of group of friends of Georgia has been formed. It includes the Central European countries, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, not Hungary though, but compensated by Romania, and the Baltic countries. Okay, they have created this group and they're very vocal supporters. So different perceptions, you know, blunder and recklessness as seen from Western Europe, a new Munich, if you want, seen from Eastern Europe. Different perceptions of the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, which happens to be also the neighborhood of Russia. You know, you can see, this Belarus, Ukraine, all this all the way to Georgia. Well, you know, this is Russia. This is former Soviet Union. This is Russia's neighborhood, or near abroad, as they call it. It just so happens that it is now also the neighborhood of the European Union, which has expanded to Poland, neighbor of Belarus and Ukraine, to Romania, who is a neighbor of Moldova, etc. So we are sharing a neighborhood. And the European Union has devised something called the European Neighborhood Policy to deal with territories on its periphery, which initially, that was the main purpose of that policy, were not meant to join the European Union. The neighborhood policy, as it was devised in 2003, 2004, was meant to do two things. First, not to create an artificial barrier between the European Union and countries that were not part of the European Union. Let's say, if Poland is a member of the European Union, Ukraine is not, or not meant to be, you're not creating a sort of barbed wire, new Berlin Wall there. You want to have a fairly open system of communication. On the other hand, you are devising this policy as an alternative to enlargement, which has just occurred, which has taken in all of Eastern Europe. That was the initial view of the neighborhood policy. Romano Prodi, who was then the president of the European Commission, called it everything but institutions. You share in every aspect of European policy except the institutions. You're not a member of the political club. That is the view widely shared in Western Europe. Now, among the new members from East Central Europe, this Friends of Georgia, if you want, it's more or less the same group, they tend to see the neighborhood policy as possibly a pre-accession policy into the EU. That is, the EU should not preclude the countries on the eastern periphery from becoming future members. We don't know when that's going to happen, but we should not rule it out. And indeed, the neighborhood policy, and there is quite a bit of money in it now, should be designed to, it's not just everything but institution, okay, everything, but possibility, not ruling out in the future the institution. So we have there a divide on what neighborhood policy should be. Indeed, we have a very similar divide about NATO expansion. At the Bucharest summit this April, the question of Georgia and Ukraine membership action plan, this is the first stage for joining NATO, the Atlantic Alliance, was raised. And you had the countries of East Central Europe, all of them supporting Georgia and Ukraine's membership action plan in NATO. And you had all the founding members of the European Union, mainly France and Germany, opposing it. So you had there a clear division. Incidentally, among the countries supporting enlargement of NATO was also Sweden, which is interesting because it's a neutral country, has never been a member of NATO. You would have thought the best way to encourage Ukraine or Georgia to join NATO, you would want to join first. But they think it's good for the others. Anyway, you have now two arguments. You have those in Eastern Europe who say, if we had given membership action plan to Georgia in April in Bucharest, maybe this would have deterred Russia moving into Georgia in August. And others say, thank God we didn't do it, because, if we had given the green light for Georgia in NATO, and then were unable to do anything about Russia's move there, not only we would no longer have Georgia, but we would no longer have NATO. So, perhaps we should think twice before promising enlargement. And this concerns, incidentally, not just governments. Obviously, this is most visible at the government level, but it concerns also division in public opinion. I will not inflict on you dozens of figures from opinion polls, but still it is interesting to note that a recent survey done in the European Union shows that following the invasion of Georgia, Europeans perceive Russia much more as a threat than before. Before that, only about 3%, I think, people in Europe, 4%, I think, 4% of Europeans deemed Russia as the greatest threat to world stability. And that went up to 17% after the invasion of Georgia. So, okay, Russia is perceived more as a threat. And then you ask, does it make them therefore more eager for new countries to join NATO? Well, not really. Clear majority of people in almost all West European countries remain firmly opposed to their government spending more on defense and enlarging NATO. The conflict between Russia and Georgia, European citizens would strongly oppose national armies defending East European nations from a Russian attack. Britain, France, Germany, etc., are all legally obliged to do that. So in Germany, Italy, Spain, majority of people say they would not want not only to send troops to Georgia. Okay, Georgia is not yet a member of NATO, but not even to the Baltic countries. Majority, if you say, would you want your troops to be sent to Lithuania today? Majority of people in those countries say no. Only in Britain and France. France is a country has the image of not being a strong enough NATO supporter. It is in France that you have stronger support for military action in case that happen. So all this is. I don't want to give you too much of that. Yeah, they say only Britain and France do more people support the idea of armies defending the Baltic states than oppose it. And there are all the details of the figures if you actually wanted it. So it's not just the governments that are divided. It's public opinion. It's public opinion as well. The third difference is in the difference, the third divide within the European Union concerns the perceptions of Russia. We have seen the European Union divided in its perceptions and in its attitudes towards the United States during the Iraq War of 2003. You remember the divide, old Europe, new Europe, the Rumsfeldian divide. So that concerned attitude towards the United States as a dividing issue within the Union. Now it is the attitude towards Russia as a dividing issue. And I'm not saying it totally overlaps, but there is a partial overlap there. You have, to put it in a nutshell, the new member states of the European Union try to put an emphasis on the menace posed by the resurgent Russia, the new imperialist power, etc., whereas the West Europeans are more concerned about what kind of relationship, what kind of partnership is possible with Russia, what would be the best leverage that the European Union can use with Russia. It's a difference of emphasis. I think the perceptions are now more convergent about the way Putin's Russia has changed, but there are differences in, if you want, not only just gut reactions to what is happening, but also to the policies that you would want to follow. It is also true that the new members were rhetorically very loud in their reaction. In terms of policies, they were not proposing very much. They were either relying on United States, wanting United States to do something, or they were calling for sanctions and things like that, or suspension of the negotiations of the partnership treaty. But none of this has played very much within the EU, so that on the whole, you had the new members plus Sweden, because of its very outspoken foreign minister, Mr. Carl Bildt, you have this divide, but no really policy input. It doesn't tell you what do you actually do. Or actually, if you look at what they do, well, then Poland was an interesting case, because you have August 8, Russian invasion of Georgia, August 14, Russia signs with the United States the treaty concerning, there's a missile base and the modernization of the Polish army by the United States, including Patriot missiles. Now, I'm not a military expert. I don't know how useful the missile shield is against missiles from Korea or Iran, but Patriot missiles are not for Iran, and the Russians certainly got the message. So it is interesting that in Poland you have the concern about resurgent Russia, mainly the implications for the Ukraine, and you have the unilateral action of signing a bilateral deal with the United States, while at the same time demanding collective action by the European Union in support of the Georgians. So not always entirely coherent or convincing to others. So on the whole, if you look at the divisive issues you have between Russia and Europe, you have, well, this one I just mentioned, the American bases in Poland and the radar in the Czech Republic as a bilateral deal with the United States. You have the issue of NATO expansion that I mentioned, which Russians consider as absolute veto. Oh, I mean, they have no right of veto, but they would consider this to be a hostile policy towards them. And thirdly, the question of Kosovo. Third dividing issue, the recognition by most, well, not just the United States, but most European states of the independence of Kosovo seceding from Serbia. And the Russian argument is, well, if you think that Kosovo can secede from Serbia, why couldn't Ossetia or Abkhazia secede from Georgia? So basically these were the three dividing issues, and that gives you some measure of the difficulty for Europe to redefine its relationship with Russia, and perhaps most difficult task on its agenda for the near future. I realize I'm possibly running out of time, so I will perhaps be quicker on the last part. But still on the Russia-Europe side, I would mention the main issues for the future. Energy, I don't go back to it, I already mentioned it, but I put it number one, energy supply, the energy dependence, and the paradox. The countries that are most dependent on Russian supply of oil and mainly gas are also the most radical in their tough posture vis-à-vis Russia. There's no correlation between your degree of dependency and accommodation to Russia. The East Europeans are the most dependent and the most firm in their attitudes towards Russia. The second issue is the stabilization of 3,500-kilometer border running from Finland all the way to the Eastern Balkans, to the Black Sea. And that includes, you know, from Kaliningrad, Belarus, Ukraine, with its Crimean complication I mentioned, Moldova, and part of its territory, Transnistria, which is seceding from Moldova, has in fact by referendum already declared secession, all the way to the Caucasus and the issues I have mentioned, there. Therefore, this is the second issue, Europe's shared neighborhood with Russia. What are the main shared interests and possible accommodation? In approaching these issues, perhaps Europeans should be aware more often how weak Russia's position relatively is. They recognize Abkhazia, Ossetia. Who else did recognize it? Nicaragua. Not even Belarus. Not even Belarus has followed. Secondly, if you look at Russia, okay, it has been doing fantastically well recently because of energy prices, because it is essentially a petrostate, to use the title of Marshall Goldman's recent book about Russia. Okay, that is how they were doing, but the price of petrol is going down now. You know, it's what, $70 a barrel. So that is no longer what it used to be. They suffer a major demographic catastrophe. The life expectancy in Russia is worse than it has been since the fall of communism. I think for men it's something like 60 years life expectancy. You know, nothing. I mean, it's real demographic catastrophe in Russia, and I could go on. I mean, the recent financial crisis. You think it's bad in this country? You think it's bad in Middlebury? Well, consider this. In the Russian stock market has lost 75%. So everything looks slightly better in this perspective if you compare it to Russia. So, okay, they've been doing well thanks to the energy card. They are fundamentally remaining very weak. Whereas I would argue that EU has a very strong position. Half a billion citizens compared to 140 million Russians, 15 times the GDP of Russia. It has the largest and most attractive market for the Russians. Gazprom gets 70% of its profits from sales in the EU, but the EU has real leverage. EU is moving rapidly into alternative energy. The EU can manage energy wastage, but Russia apparently cannot. Russia's losses, they lose more gas every year in Russia through wastage than France actually consumes. So that just gives you the scale. I could go down the list, including simply the fact that the Russians have got used to travel. They like the Côte d'Azur, they like the skiing resorts in France, they like Carlsbad and its spas. They bought most of it. So this is it, you know. Russia actually has been very much sucked into this and into the European market, very dependent on it, and I don't think it can simply pull out. So this is something the Europeans should bear in mind when they think of it. In 2 words about the United States, I said the Europeans are divided. Well, the Americans, in a way as well. It seemed on the surface that there was a sort of, united response. First, Cheney's visit there, $1 billion promised, modernization of the Georgian army. Okay, you would think this is the remnants of the Bush policy in the area. But then you had, because of the election campaign, an assumption that was made by some immediately after the Georgian invasion. This will help McCain. A new Cold War with Russia, that is a good posture for him. Not very good for Obama. Maybe for that reason, Obama was playing more or less the same tune. So at least superficially, you had the impression that yes, the Americans were competing about who was going to be tougher on Russia. Then you look more closely, you realize that both camps, both main parties, seem to me divided. Among the Republicans, okay, you have the neocons who are waiting for World War IV or something like that, a clash of civilization, Islamo-terrorism, and now new Cold War with Russia. You always need a new enemy for a new presidential campaign. I'm caricaturing deliberately, but this is only to point out that there is a mainstream thinking of the Republican Party, which is very different. You might have seen the op-ed piece by 2 former foreign secretaries. I heard recently on NPR an hour-long debate, 5 former foreign secretaries speaking, Baker, Schultz, Kissinger, Colin Powell, Republican foreign secretaries, all very moderate, very calm, no hectoring, no posturing vis-à-vis Russia, saying Russia's legitimate, Kissinger should, Russia's legitimate interests must be recognized. We should be looking for a partnership with Russia. None of the new Cold War rhetoric among former Republican foreign secretaries. So this is just to put it in real perspective. And you could say that the Democrats also are divided. You have also among Democrats, you have Madeleine Albright and that tradition of people, you know, Europe whole and free and enlarge NATO, enlarge European Union and expand democracy. You read Holbrooke on Georgia, you know, can't get tougher than Holbrooke on Georgia. So he would be very close to the McCain position in a way. So whereas you also have among the Democrats a pragmatist. I'm told Obama has 300 advisors on foreign policy. That's at least 297 too many. But among them, Tony Lake is supposed to be a main one. He's a reasonable, moderate man. On Russia is McFaul. I mean, all of them would be reasonable. So both camps seem to be divided. But whatever the case, Georgia didn't play a role in the campaign. It could have. It didn't, because there was a financial crisis in the meantime, and everybody looked a different way. Now, I completely ran out of time. Therefore, I'm just 2 words to conclude. We are now facing really. In the aftermath of the Georgian crisis, if we look at the picture, Russia, Europe, the United States, we have a different Russia, different West, and different East in between. Different Russia because it is more authoritarian, more assertive in foreign policy, and less interested in our approval. You know, most of the 1990s they were desperate to get Western approval. That is, they're no longer interested in that. You have a different West compared to what you had in the 90s, because US leadership is no longer what it used to be. I don't have to dwell on the effects of Iraq and the Bush presidency. That is certainly the case. And Europe, which was down or completely neglected in most of the 1990s, now, after enlargement, now with the Georgian crisis and its mediating role, is showing that perhaps it can have something resembling a common foreign and security policy. And then the East has also changed, expanding to Poland, to Czech Republic, Hungary. That was the easy part. The lands in between Europe and Russia, this periphery from Belarus all the way to the Caucasus, that is a much more difficult periphery to manage. We used to have a policy for wider Europe. This is wilder Europe. This is much more difficult one to handle. And the second conclusion is that we lived in the period after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, with the assumption that geopolitics is declining or on the way out, and geoeconomics, in this building this is appropriate, is on the rise, that globalization brings back a new version of convergence theory. We're all heading in the same way, the West, Russia, even China. Okay, they only have capitalism, not yet democracy, but in due course they are bound to evolve in that direction. This was sort of the dominant view of the past decade. I think with what we have seen in China, but more importantly in Russia under Putin, the idea that you can have authoritarian capitalism, that we're not heading necessarily all towards the happy world of liberal democracy and market economy. That, I think, is the most new realization after the Georgian crisis, that the challenge both for the United States after the election, as for the European Union, for the coming decades, I would say, will not be democratizing the planet, but learning to live with two authoritarian great powers, resurgent Russia and hyper-capitalist China. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to take a few minutes.
It seems to me that your argument is made from a very U.S. and European perspective, and I'm not going to take your argument from the Russian side. That is to say, Bush and co. spent years and money advising the Georgians, sending military and economic advisors, training their troops, and encouraging them to take risks against their neighbor. And NATO, EU, has proceeded in its plans to ring Russia with its allies and to make Russia feel that it's being surrounded by hostile forces. What could we expect from Russia after Georgia has been trained and prepared, and after Russia has been ringed and we're flirting with Georgia and with Ukraine, to bring them as far west as possible after we've been assuring them that NATO really is not intended to have anything to do with Russia, and those missiles are really intended for Iran and whoever else. And certainly nobody believed that. And the fact that you pointed out about Poland signing the deal immediately after indicates that that was a pure fiction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, you are right that I was mainly giving a European perspective on these events, and I was more emphasizing the divides among Europeans in their perceptions of Russia rather than Russian perception themselves. Well, it is true that what the Russians basically are telling us through the Georgian episode is Russia is back. You may like it or you may not like it, but you have to now take it as a fact. This was the main message. No major problem of European security can be solved without us. That is the main message. You better take that on board. You want to play neighborhood policy? Well, it happens to be our neighborhood as well, and therefore the idea that you will simply establish American bases on our borders and say, oh, but you don't have to worry about that because it's not targeted at you, well, we no longer buy that. So that is really the Russian posture, and that is what Putin has been thriving on. I mean,
you said your comment was, this just so happens that it's also the neighborhood of the EU. It wasn't the neighborhood of the EU.
It's a new neighborhood. Yeah.
It has become
It has become the neighborhood of the EU.
which is provocative.
Well, the fact that it is a neighborhood need not be provocative. The question is what kind of neighborhood? And the whole question for the EU is to devise a concept of a neighborhood that would not be seen as threatening for Russia. It is not in Europe's interest. I didn't have time to dwell on that, but it is not in Europe's interest to have a new Cold War with Russia for the reasons I mentioned. There is energy dependence. People don't like energy dependence? Fine, I don't like energy dependence. You want alternative? Sure. Okay. Iran? Okay, no. Chavez? No. Okay. So what is a safe alternative? I mean, this is silly. You may reduce the dependency. You may think this dependency on Russia is too big. You want to reduce it so that the leverage is less. But for the foreseeable future, Europe will be heavily dependent on Russian energy, for one. Secondly, for security. If we have all these unresolved territorial conflicts in the Caucasus, in Moldova, potentially in the Ukraine, around the Black Sea, this is our neighborhood. Now that we have expanded eastwards, it happens to be Russia's neighborhood. It is not in our interest to have an unstable and insecure neighborhood where either you would have ethnic conflicts or you have proliferation of failed states, corrupt criminal networks established, all sorts of things that the European Union is trying to combat. And the European Union, if it is useful for something, as I said, it doesn't have many divisions, but if it's useful for something, it has helped significantly new democracies to build state institutions, the rule of law. The main conditions for joining the EU is not just to have elections, but to be a rule of law, to be capable of implementing the acquis communautaire, the common legislations, the rules and norms adopted by. So all this need not be confrontational with Russia. And this is why I would separate EU neighborhood policy from NATO expansion. First, because EU neighborhood policy need not lead to EU membership. As I said, it was in fact devised for the opposite, though it may be open-ended for some. But I would separate it from, distinguish it from NATO membership. These two are not the same. I mean, when you say Russia encircled, that is indeed how the Russians see it. But I think that they would themselves admit that the two should be separated. NATO is a military institution. It is really associated in the Russian mind with the Cold War and the idea that you build military bases in Georgia, train and equip. Well, they didn't fare too well against the Russian army, but still, they are being retrained and re-equipped. And I think this is a very different proposition from EU. I would in fact say that we now have a slight reversal of role. In Central Europe, we saw first an expansion of NATO, and then a few years after, followed by the expansion of the EU. I would say now, after Georgia, expansion of NATO is out. It's not going to happen. It may happen perhaps in the Balkans. I don't know if Macedonia, Croatia join, etc. But it will not happen on the border of the Soviet Union. I simply do not believe, and it's not just the opinion polls I read to you, nobody wants to go to war for that. So my feeling is that EU will have a much more of an opening in dealing with this region than NATO. But you are right on a very important point. An attempt to try to understand what the Russians are feeling. The only relationship to what I said is the feeling of failure and humiliation at the loss of the empire. And the fact that Russia was not an empire like the others. The fact that Russia has never distinguished between nation state and empire. It has been growing steadily. It's not an overseas empire like India for the British or Algeria. No, it's contiguous to Russian territory. Muscovy grew, and you can put on a map how over the centuries it expanded eastward, westwards, etc. And in the Caucasus, and the whole 19th century is full of that. And Russian literature is full of that turmoil. So that because they don't distinguish between nation state and empire, the loss of the Soviet Union, and they confront them with the question, what is a Russian state? And they don't have an answer. They never had it in such a form. And I suppose Putin came in trying to say, I want to reestablish Russian statehood after the 90s, where the state has disintegrated. Now he's playing on the imperial note, not just Russian statehood, but the imperial note, because he knows that nationalism is a powerful legitimizing resource for him. So, yes, I think this is a great difficulty. But the fact that we try to understand Russia doesn't mean necessarily we have to condone it. We can try to understand, and I think many Europeans, as I said, not only considered Saakashvili's policies reckless, but they would certainly not consider wise establishing NATO military bases on Russia's border.
There's still a few questions.
You pointed out that Europe should not see how big Russia is, and you pointed out several points to that. What do you mean by that? Do you think that Europe should not fear Russia that much, or it does not objectively evaluate Russian power? Why did you point out that Russia is not as strong as many people perceive?
Well, because the perception of Russia in Western Europe tends to be related to two things. First, the new assertiveness that I talked about, which includes military. If you look at the expansion of the military budget, well, that is something to go by. And secondly, Russia's use of energy for political purposes. We have seen how they used it in the case of Ukraine and others. So these are the two things that Europeans see: rise of military power, use of energy as a political weapon. So that is the dominant perception. I try to say they don't sufficiently think through the fundamentals. The fundamentals of Europe are strong. Not only we are, as I said, more numerous, GDP per capita 15 times that of Russia, we are much stronger, and we should, and Russia, except for the petrodollars and military might, doesn't have much because it has a demographic catastrophe and all those things I mentioned. So I said, well, you know, instead of...
What should that change? Should Europe's policy towards Russia be harsher and less scared? Are you trying to make that point?
Well, the point is that if you're trying to devise a long-term policy, right, you're not just looking at what happened in Georgia last week. You want to, obviously, to examine carefully the reasons for that and the consequences, but you're trying to devise a long-term policy. And what I try to see is I see a much weaker Russia than the one that is dominantly perceived in Europe. I would say I see a demographic catastrophe. I see that besides oil, They haven't used the oil reserves to modernize their economy. I just do not. They have alienated most of their neighbors, and I could go on like that. So I would say the EU, therefore, need not to focus just on the military and oil. It should be, in its long-term view, say, well, we are the main partners for Russia, and we're likely to stay so. Russia has a very strong interest. If it wants to modernize, it needs partnership with us, because the business, the new technologies, education for their elites, all this will come via Europe. So we have the possibilities of becoming a partner, and we should play this positive asset vis-à-vis Russia. Whether Russian elites will be enlightened and wanting to look in that direction, that is a different matter. That was the main point, looking at the long-term perspective and seeing Europe's strengths and perhaps Russia's weaknesses. Yes.
Thank you for coming tonight. I was curious about what you said about the shared neighborhood, the common neighborhood between Europe and Russia, and to what extent do you think that extension of European membership will be used as a policy tool in managing that border?
Yeah, this is an entirely new situation for which most West Europeans were never prepared. The fact that Moldova is neighbor of the European Union, no member of the European Union until Romania joined a year ago, would have thought so, and comes with it a lot of perplexity and ambivalence, because you have, this was my argument, you have really a divided European Union. You have a country like Romania who will say, well, now that we are in the European Union, Moldova is our neighbor, and Moldova is entitled to become a future member, and Moldova, that used to be Bessarabia before, that used to be Greater Romania. So if you're a good Romanian patriot, if you want to challenge Russia on its turf, that is Moldova, and European Union basically should support us in this endeavor, etc., etc. So this is where you see how new members pursue their agenda inside the European Union in trying to shape the neighborhood policy. How far will they go? That is a different matter, because the neighborhood policy, it's not just what policy Europe will have towards Moldova, it's what policy does Europe want to have vis-à-vis Russia. That is the crucial question. And I mentioned some of the issues that are there at stake, and we simply have perhaps a different hierarchy of priorities among EU members about what that policy should be. You have the question of security, you have the question of democracy and promoting democracy in the neighborhood, you have energy dependence, etc., etc. And I could draw even a longer list. To put it very simply, for new members, promoting democracy, colored revolutions or otherwise, in the neighborhood, that should be the priority. This is the policy support first. Security and energy, that comes after. The view from Germany would be, energy, crucially important. You want a big major deal on energy. Security, yes, crucially important. We want to make sure that some of the arms reduction agreements that had been negotiated at the end of the Cold War under Gorbachev and then at the beginning of Yeltsin have now been done away with. They've been dismissed. Some of them by the United States, some of them now more recently by Russia itself. This is worrying for Europeans. They would say security, big issue for our future relationship with Russia. And then, of course, democracy, human rights, promotion, colored revolution. Okay, maybe, but that is, I'm overstating the contrast, but the hierarchy of priorities is different among EU members, and this is why sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. You want an example where it works was Ukraine during the Orange Revolution. You have contested elections, mobilization in the Ukraine, etc., etc. A situation which could have gone wrong, could have gone towards a violent clash, right? Could have been a civil war, whatever. At that stage, the new members, particularly Poland, very active, etc., want to get involved. Can they get involved on their own? The Ukrainian president wouldn't talk to them at that time. You are in the midst of a contested election. They don't want Polish meddling in it. However, if it's the European Union that comes in, as Mr. Solana did, European foreign minister, if you want, comes there with the Polish president and the Lithuanian president, the two neighbors, and they accompany the representative of the European Union, well, that's the ideal combination, if you want, because you have the motivation and the knowledge of the area by the new members, but you have the clout and the responsibility of the EU as such. That is when EU was effective in brokering an agreement which, as you know, has led to the political change and allowed Yushchenko to become president. So this is where the neighborhood policy can work and can be at its best. My main question about the neighborhood policy is, can you help transform the periphery without the promise, even distant promise, of membership? What's in it for a neighbor to do the changes in their governance, in their economic institutions, fight organized crime, do all the things that EU stands for, if there is not that promise of membership? So this is Europe's dilemma. It has been remarkably successful in extending stability and democracy on its periphery through the promise of membership of the center. You stabilize the periphery by promising it to join the center. But you become eventually victim of your own success. And you have now such a long list of candidates. The EU is now 27 members. And you have all the Balkan countries, former Yugoslavia and Albania to come. You have now former Soviet republics from Ukraine to Georgia who claim to be candidates. You have Turkey as not only a candidate, it's more than a candidate, started even negotiating. So you have this long list of members which really confronts the EU with its capacity to digest, if you want, and remain itself. The worst service it could render to the periphery is for the center to melt down. So the whole process is credible so long as there is something to join. If you simply become a much more heterogeneous union, essentially based on market, customs regulation, some minimal observance of human rights, okay, you could enlarge, but you will not be a political entity. You will not be the kind of entity that intervened during the conflict in Georgia and could become a mediator. So you really have two concepts of the EU that are at stake. Either you pursue enlargement as a sort of geopolitical vision, you want to stabilize faraway countries of which you know little, to paraphrase a British infamous phrase at the time of Munich, back to Munich. And you're going to do that by basically diluting the EU and rendering it politically ineffective, but you will be spreading, as I say, the market, some norms, perhaps even some human rights. Or you want the EU to be also a political actor in a globalized world. And this is what I was saying at the end. The idea that we're all going to this post-1989 end of history, this is the globalization, we're all marching towards democracy and the free market, and Russia will join, perhaps China. That is not true. What we have now is reassertion of the logic of power in China, in Russia, in the United States, in India, etc. So the question for the Europeans, do they want to be a political actor? Well, if you want to be a political actor, think twice before enlarging to 40, 45 countries and becoming the United Nations of the European continent. And it will be a nice talk shop, but it will have no political clout whatsoever.